You live in Chicago, yes?
Yes, we're just outside of Chicago, about a half hour west, so
Okay.
in the suburbs. But
And you run a consulting company focusing on neurodiversity.
correct. So I have two kind of branches, and I have one focusing on neurodiversity in the corporate space, and then one focusing on neurodiversity in the academic and education space.
And how do they differ?
Just different audiences, same material, same information, same challenges, right? Just looks a little different from when you're in school and applying it in that regard, and when you're, in a position or a leader of a company, that looks a little bit different. But other than that, same content, same strategies. We just modify it to the audience.
I'm going to show my biases here. I always imagine that America, and especially places like Chicago, are miles ahead of the UK in dyslexia and neurodiversity awareness. Am I right in that?
I hate to share with you or disappoint you in that I would not necessarily say that's correct or accurate. I think that there are certain companies and individuals who've come a very long way. Certain academic institutions that are on board. I think right now the term neurodiversity is still very much unknown. This is when I have done all my work in the academic space for almost 20 years now. I've worked specifically in the executive functioning skills development space. And that is a term that still to this day, even though many of us are very familiar and comfortable with it, most individuals do not have any idea what that means. They just assume it's executive coaching. So we've now changed that term we've coined it individual effectiveness skills, to kind of share that encompasses all the ways we process information, organize, plan, self-regulate, get things done. So I think there's a lack of awareness around neurodiversity, dyslexia, a lot of the cognitive differences that are invisible and really can't be seen, and that poses a big challenge.
I suppose one of the big differences with schools and businesses is the kind of vocabulary you use to reach the people you're trying to reach. So executive functioning produces that kind of problem in a business. So
absolutely, and there is. I think it's just getting that vernacular straight when you're kind of flipping between the two. And really, at the end of the day, it's about normalizing it, putting it to common language, finding common strategies, just very pragmatic, realistic approaches to not only educating and building awareness around what these differences are, what they might look like, because you can't see them, right? This is the challenge. Yeah. But then also providing options and solutions and action steps that we can integrate day to day, whether that's in the business world, in the classroom as a teacher, or a student at home. It doesn't matter. We need to figure out what can actually be done so that we can be successful.
And how receptive are your clients to this kind of advice?
So it's a big learning curve here. So kind of back to your original point, I think there is not as much awareness around this. And when you can't see something, it really makes it challenging to wrap your head around it. And so it's sometimes an uphill battle to kind of explain what it is we're talking about and why it's important. So it's a big learning curve there. But once we start to have those conversations, and we have someone who's like familiar with the space, let's say, they're very receptive. And so every time I'm doing a speaking or a training to, a group of administrators or professionals or educators or parents even, right? As soon as you start talking and putting it into those layman's terms and making connections and relating to actual real life experiences, that's when the light bulbs go off. And then we have that receptivity. So we've got the buy-in, we've got the understanding, and we can really see the power that just having some basic strategies and knowledge can have.
So let's put this onto the ground level, as it were. Let's say you're giving some training or consultancy to a school. Is it only that school that would take your advice on board, or is it what we might call in Britain a local education authority who would take that advice on board? Or how does that work? Is it that you're constantly making inroads but into individual schools, or is it bigger than that?
So there are some groups that have more, like a curriculum around executive function skills development or certain programs, and I think some of those are in at the higher level, like offices of education, regional or local. For me, it's always been individual schools, groups, or sometimes a district, which could encompass maybe 4 schools kind of put together and have that trickle down effect where we're training a group who's going to then bring that information back to their team. But they're relatively receptive. It's interesting because I think that everyone's very overwhelmed with everything they have to accomplish and all of the standards that need to be met and the curriculum that needs to be fulfilled. And it's very difficult for them to wrap their heads around how to integrate this into or actually do this work. It's not that I think they don't want to understand it or work with it, but I think it poses a real challenge in that they don't know how simple it can be. And they're just missing the background knowledge.
So do you find that there's not a lot of background dyslexia awareness training for teachers in your area?
Yes, I would agree with that. I think there are some really active organizations and groups. We have a lot of parents who are really involved with helping to educate the schools and the teachers. So it's kind of like the reverse instead of the schools having the training that they need. And, it's kind of the flip flop where you've got these really active. I think I mentioned to you, my best friend has 6 children, 5 of whom have dyslexia.
Yeah.
And so it has been and she works as well, but it has been her mission to really get in there and advocate for these kids, to train her children as to what to do, to advocate for themselves, and then to train each of the teachers and help their kids to train the teachers in what dyslexia is, right? It's not just, oh, I reversed my E's and I write them backwards, which is what most people, I think, still here in this area do believe, kind of to your original point, which is frustrating because it is a very complex processing disorder and there's a broad spectrum of how it manifests, right? And I think that there is a missing piece in awareness for teachers around this and all cognitive differences, truly.
But you touched on a really interesting point. What involvement does a parent need to have in order to get the accommodations that their child needs at school?
Okay. So this is like a multi-layered question for me. So my personal philosophy in my businesses, we're all about ownership, independence, accountability. This is not an excuse. Let's just figure out what's going on, come up with the strategies, and teach you how to advocate and accommodate and account for all this, right? Let's draw out the best. That being said, there's I think a challenge that we face here in my perspective, and I work with public schools, private schools, elementary, so the primary initial grades through the middle level grades, the high school through the 12th grade, and then also some college students and groups as well. And so I've got a broad, like private, public, all of it, broad range of of gathering of information of what this all looks like in these institutions. And I think the challenge is that it isn't well understood, so it isn't well supported. So parents do need to have a role because the teachers and the educators don't always have the understanding. And again, to be very clear, it's not that they don't want to, there's just not enough time to do that and then to learn it to the level of detail they need to learn it to. And so the parents really do need to be involved in kind of like providing that training and education. And then we encourage them to pull back and then help their students to advocate for themselves.
And how much might that cost to an average parent?
So, and we had chatted about this briefly in a phone conversation not long ago. And so we have, and I don't know, I apologize, I'm not familiar enough with, the systems in Europe and the UK. I know it looks kind of varies country by country. I'm sure region by region even. I feel as though here, the school supported programs, like your legal plan that you get in place is called a 504 or an IEP, Individualized Education Plan. Those plans, in some schools and districts are, relatively easy to get when you have the proper diagnosis, documentation, you have the meetings, you're very, proactive about it. And in others, there's kind of that question in the States right now of funding, right? There's a fear around these plans that if we give too many children these plans, that's going to cost us money because we have to hire additional support. And then there's kind of a panic and a tendency to try to pull kids off of those plans. Now, I'm a big proponent of using the plans when you need them, but also of teaching the individual the skills and the coping mechanisms and getting them the development they need. So that's a long answer, I understand, to the question, which was originally how expensive can this be? So in a perfect world, it's happening in the schools, right? We're getting the interventions and the accommodations, both that we need to help to compensate and develop. But because dyslexia is so misunderstood, I would really say, and this might be a little provocative, I would really say that it's very rare to find educators or a program in a school that actually understands truly how to support dyslexia and truly understands what it is and all its complexity.
And to find out.
Yes, and then it's money to do the training and to adopt the programs, and they'll adopt specific, reading development programs, and there are some schools who do a fabulous job with that. So I don't want to come across as being extremely negative, but it's very frustrating for me because both in executive functioning, ADHD, autism spectrum, those worlds that I work in, as well as dyslexia, I watch the impact that it has on these kids. So cost-wise, because it's not being as well supported, I'm trying to be careful in how I say it. A little tired today, so hopefully I'm not coming across edgy, but it's really not all that well supported or understood. Yeah. Therefore, families need to go private, and the interventions are pretty pricey. I have a good friend who does dyslexia work, and she's a specialist and has gone through extensive training, and she works with students, I think on average, we just talked last week, about 3 times a week, and this hourly rate, let's say that I'm assuming about a 1-hour session, can be, let's say $75, $80 an hour times 3. And this is going on for months because it has to be intensive interventions, as to, bring the skills up to a level where we are functioning, where we would like to be functioning. So it can be extremely costly. We personally, I can speak from experience here with addressing pieces for our own children related to autism spectrum and ADHD intervention supports across a range of providers. And we probably over the course of 2 years personally invested, I would say $25,000 to $30,000.
Wow.
So I don't know if that gives you a little bit of a, so it can be very costly. And unfortunately, the byproduct is that a lot of times students don't get the support they need because they don't necessarily have the funds if the insurance coverage isn't good or if they don't have that available.
So do you find that, as it were, that the rich get cleverer and the poor don't? The rich succeed in education more than the poorer families?
Yeah, I think that I would say that's probably pretty accurate, and it becomes frustrating. And we live in a lovely suburb and it's relatively affluent, and so a lot of people around here can afford it, but there are so many who cannot. And or for some of us, we had to sacrifice many other things in order to find a way to pay for that.
And one of the issues is that, I mean, I caricature it by saying the rich and the poor, but actually it's not that. There's a big sliding scale, and that many people in the middle suffer. One of the bugbears I have about the British system is that in general, if you want to be assessed properly, officially, as dyslexic, you have to pay for it yourself, and it costs hundreds of pounds, up to like £750 or something. And the poorer families can't afford that. And so they might not be able to even argue for the accommodations that they need. Have you got a similar system in the States, or is there more help for people to get the assessments?
No, it kind of in line with what I had mentioned about the actual, once we're pursuing the plan and having the support in the school system, it's very similar. It's just not understood, and they don't necessarily have the training or the testing to really hone in on, because dyslexia is so nuanced and so layered. And so generally families will go private. Occasionally they'll have luck in getting the school district to pay for it because the school district doesn't have the proper, assessment tools and training and whatnot. But generally they have to go private. And the private testing around here ranges, I would say between $2,000 and $5,000 to have a full battery of tests done with a provider who can really, truly understand and identify dyslexia. Many of them kind of stop at a certain level and have a hard time, and they'll say generalized processing disorder. Yeah, so it can be frustrating. There are some fabulous ones in the area, but again, this is out of pocket between $2,000 and $5,000.
You may not know this, and so I apologize for asking a question out of your field, but America is a big country, and there are 50 states of America. Do they all have similar laws and provision for dyslexia, or are there big differences between the states, or even within the states, between the counties of the states? I don't know.
Right. And this is kind of where my head is going to explode, is when we get into like the legalities of it, right? I'm very much about the pragmatic strategies, the consulting, the advising, the solutions piece of it. However, I would say, universally, the education system is relatively consistent across the country. It's relatively traditional. There's some charter schools, there's some alternative ways of scheduling and doing things, but generally speaking, it's pretty consistent and traditional through the 12th grade until they get up to university. So I would say regionally, there's differences within schools, but across the board, I would say, and there are certain areas that might be a little bit more progressive than others. I think probably like California at times has been known to be, I'm coming from the Midwest, right? So kind of conservative, a little slower to warm up to change, not as progressive. I'm sure there are regions that are a little bit more forward thinking, but yeah, it's interesting to hear your perspective, because from my perception, I had a conversation with a manufacturing company, or they work in the manufacturing space doing pre-employment selection, a great group. And we had a lovely conversation around finding best fit positions where we can really help people to find how to capitalize on their strengths, and how to get into a position that's going to best account for, be able to accommodate for those, challenged areas. And so it was interesting because we spoke about the system in the UK and what that looks like. Funny enough, my niece's boyfriend is from London. He's Irish, but grew up in London. And, he is now here in the States. And we kind of just talk about the differences in the systems altogether. And we think it's I personally, and many of those here I talk to, think it's fabulous that we're really starting to look at those, strengths and weaknesses. We don't want to pigeonhole or label anyone, right? But we're looking at that early on and kind of trying to identify, not everyone needs to go to a four-year institution or a, graduate post-grad program, or, technical schools, trade schools. There are phenomenal opportunities available. And the mindset here in the US, for a while, I think it's starting to shift. It's very much like, this is what you do after 12th grade. You go to college, it's 4-year or else. And it's not really, I feel in the UK at an earlier age, you guys are starting to look at and really identify, okay, where do we think you're really going to fit? So that's our kind of perception here.
And it's you will find as well that in other countries, it's even, let's say, even more progressive. So in Germany is a very strange country. That there are different states, different federal states, different Länder, Bundesländer in Germany. And they actually have different laws and different, they define dyslexia differently. And yet the German education system doesn't fixate on academic success, on going to an Ivy League university, in the same way that the American and the British university systems do. You know, Oxford and Cambridge are the ultimate, and if you get an apprenticeship, that's not very good. Well, in Germany, they don't see it like that. In Germany, they see the full spectrum of what you can achieve. And I think that's a very progressive way of doing it.
I would agree. My brother-in-law and his family lived in Germany for a long time, so they attended German schools. They were outside of Mannheim, so they were a little bit more, you know, so they, lovely area, but it's just interesting to kind of hear their perspective. The kids, you know, were fully immersed in German, and it is a different system. And it's just interesting to hear your perspective, because I feel as though in some ways, you know, you guys are so far ahead of us and looking at things a little bit less cookie cutter, straight lines, and kind of looking at the bigger picture. And for us here, the other component that comes in, especially when we talk about dyslexia and processing disorders, is the college entrance exam. So we had the ACT and the SAT exam.
Okay.
So take these exams typically a year or so before they, you know, apply to their college or university. And it is a big deal. In light of COVID, the nice part is that they're starting to put a little less stress on that, because they couldn't conduct the exams because they'd all been canceled. But it's a big deal. And unfortunately for those tests, and I tell this story all the time, I have a number of individuals, extremely intelligent, high IQ, but perhaps dyslexia or processing disorder or ADHD. These tests are not set up for kids like that. The format isn't great. The accommodations aren't great. Yes, they might get extended time. You can fight to have them be allowed to have the test read to them, which we very strongly advocate for, but it's tough. And the tests are not set up, so it's not an accurate reflection of their ability level.
Yeah.
When we're talking about these cognitive differences, and it's extremely frustrating because the impact that it has on their self-esteem and their mental health, both that the school systems aren't set up in understanding how to support them and how much harder they have to work. And in addition, now they want to go to a great school, but they're bombing these entrance exams because they don't have the ability. Doesn't mean they're not intelligent.
Yeah.
Sorry, I could speak about this for hours, but it's heartbreaking, really, on a personal note, just to have seen so many kids struggle.
Well, I suppose in that case, is there any one significant thing you wish that the schooling system would change to accommodate neurodiverse people?
Okay, so I can go really microscopic and give you a long list, but I would just say, kind of right back to where we started the conversation, it's the training and education. I think a lot of the times, if we just, and it doesn't have to be as complicated, it doesn't have to be a full like $20,000 package, just the education around what dyslexia is, autism, what it really looks like. You can't see it, right? So the assumptions and the marginalization is a real challenge, both in the corporate world and in the academic space. It's just assumed that a person is lazy and doesn't care because they can't get somewhere on time, or that they're unintelligent because they can't put their words together correctly or spell correctly on a page. It's very heartbreaking. So I think if we could get some real pragmatic training, and this is where my passion comes from, obviously, and what I do, get a little fired up over it. I think that's the one thing I would change, is that it be required that, you know, all teachers have kind of ongoing training. It's one thing to get training one time while you're in school on something, but it's ongoing. You have to brush up on it every year around cognitive differences. Just understand them. What do they really look like? What can you do in your classroom, in the moment, as a student, as a parent? Practical strategies, because I think people shy away from what's not understood and can't be seen. And I think that people struggle to implement anything because they think it's going to be such a big deal and it's overwhelming, and they kind of just shut down and avoid it, has been from all perspectives, you know, whether they're educator, administrator, parent, student, it's overwhelming, but it doesn't have to be. So I wish that they would just require some fundamental training on kind of an ongoing basis, you know, short and sweet, down and dirty. Here's what it looks like. Here's what to do. Don't forget. Here's some new stuff. Just keep this in mind. Here's how you can help support and change your methods to really engage and include. It's about inclusion, right? Including all of those with cognitive differences. I really don't think we're doing a good job of it here in the States. I hesitate to try not to offend anyone, but that is my opinion. And that's my experience in almost 20 years of doing this and seeing this in a variety of capacities.